Video is going to be about the new monarchs, and these kings and royalty were also known as the national monarchies. And this involved a phenomenon of greater political centralization in the 15th and 16th centuries. And what this means is that in a handful of states, the kings were becoming increasingly powerful in the 15th and 16th centuries. If you look at Europe in 1300, you can see how divided and decentralized it is. Even in territories that kind of look like France, kind of look like Spain, maybe kind of look like England, they were highly decentralized, which means very small little pockets of governance. Usually that governance provided in the feudal structure by a lord or a knight, so decentralized. The new monarchs brought about a greater level of centralization. This means putting more power in the hands of the central government, where governance is not so local and divided, decentralized, but is more centralized. Here you can see the extremes of decentralization in Central Europe during the Middle Ages, especially in what today we call Germany. Lots of little pockets of control by various lords. The difference is the new monarchs, they brought about greater centralization in the 15th and 16th centuries to the point where you can start to really see the formation of France, Spain, Portugal, England, and here's the Austrian Empire here as well. So what will the kings have to do to achieve this? I mean, think back to our studies of the political and social order. Who will they have to take power from in order to gain more and more control and political centralization over these lands? They'll have to take power away from a couple sources. One is their fellow nobles. They'll have to take power away, increasingly take power away from the lords and the knights. And then the other group that the new monarchs will have to take power from is the Catholic Church. So these are two of the big facets through which the new monarchs gained increasing power and centralization, was by reducing the power of the lords and the church. So here are some of the characteristics. The new monarchs found new sources of income, and we'll talk about that. They created their own professional armies, and what this allowed them to do is be less reliant on their lords, and therefore they weren't as dependent on them. They could use these armies. In fact, they didn't have to depend on the lords. They could use these armies to seize more and more power back from their lords. Additionally, they created more administration to create better run governments, and they negotiated a new relationship with the Catholic Church that gave kings increasing amounts of power. Let's start with new sources of income. Basically, what the kings were able to do was they were able to send out their bureaucrats, their government workers, down the revived trade routes that had come back in the late Middle Ages, and to send their government workers down these trade routes to demand and collect taxes from a larger percentage of the population. And what this did was the new tax income allowed monarchs to employ more government workers, bureaucrats, and this allowed them to collect even more money. And this allowed them to fund an independent army that was answerable only to the king. The king didn't have to rely on the lords, and they could use the army to force the lords to give them back more power. Let's go for some specific examples here. We'll start with France. Charles VII, he strengthened royal finances, as you can see, by imposing some new taxes like the taille on land. And these were major new sources of income that he then used to create the first permanent royal army. Also in France, Francis I, this is into the 16th century, And Charles VII was in the 15th century, as you can see here. Into the 16th century, Francis I became so powerful that he was able to, here you can see, reach an agreement with the Pope, known as the Concordat of Bologna, and that gave the king power to nominate bishops, abbots, other church officials. And what this did was it gave the French monarch increasing amounts of control over the church in French lands. In England, it went even a step further in the 16th century. Henry VIII, who you may have heard of previously, he declared himself the head of the Church of all of England, the supreme leader of the entire Church of England, and therefore he took over complete spiritual authority and authority over the church within all English lands. He took all the wealth and money of the church and invested it in his own kingdom. It's important to remember that the new monarchs did not gain absolute power in the 15th and 16th centuries. The lords still had a lot of local control. The kings were not, these new monarchs were not powerful enough to completely control these territories. The lords still had a lot of local control, but the kings were becoming increasingly powerful. There was still a lot of decentralized power held by the lords. Now here you can see this map, and it looks like France, it looks like Spain, it looks like England, but there's still a lot of little pockets of control. So you can see some major states here forming, especially in Western Europe. You can also see that in Central Europe, a tremendous amount of decentralization, local, very local political power and governance still existed. And you can imagine what this meant for the relationships between the centralized powers and the decentralized powers. What it meant was the centralized powers were able to basically push around and walk all over the decentralized powers. The decentralized powers could not bring the financial and military resources to bear to compete with the centralized powers. And the centralized powers were basically able to bend the decentralized powers to their will. And once one state became increasingly centralized, like England, this really brought about the need for greater centralization in places like France and Spain, because if these powers did not centralize to a greater degree, they could not have competed in power politics and in military struggles with a more centralized, better equipped, better trained, and more numerous armies that the centralized powers were able to accomplish. All right, thanks for listening, and see you later.